the wrong train, a ruined bride, a desperate child, a guarded rancher. When Evelyn Price's wedding dream shatters at a dusty Wyoming station, a bold little girl in oversized boots offers an impossible bargain: marry my daddy instead. But love built on desperation must survive fever, foreclosure, fire, and the return of the con man who destroyed everything. Some promises aren't written in letters, they're forged in flame. If you're ready for a story about second chances, stubborn hearts, and love that refuses to quit, stay with me until the very end. And when you do, hit that like button and comment your city below. I want to see how far Evelyn's story travels across this world. The wedding dress had cost $17. Evelyn Price remembered that number because she'd counted it out twice, once in coins at the dressmaker's shop in Philadelphia, and once in tears 3 nights ago when she'd realized no groom was coming to see it worn. Now the ivory silk sagged against her shoulders like wet paper, the hem gray with Wyoming dust, the lace cuffs frayed from 3 days of wringing her own hands raw. She sat on the station bench in Dusmeyer with her carpet bag at her feet and her spine straight because that was all she had left, posture and pride, and the pride was starting to crack. The morning train had come and gone. So had the afternoon freight. The evening passenger service sat idling at the platform now, black smoke curling into a sky gone pink with sunset, and the conductor kept glancing her way like he couldn't decide if she was decoration or debris. Evelyn didn't look back. She'd learned that much in 3 days. Don't look, don't explain, don't cry where people can see you do it. The station master, a soft-bellied man named Horace, who smelled like tobacco and pity, had stopped asking questions by the second morning. Now he just left coffee on the bench rail when he passed, too hot and too bitter. But Evelyn drank it anyway because it gave her something to do with her hands, besides clutch the letter she'd read so many times the creases had split. Dearest Evelyn, I await your arrival with a heart full of hope. Dewsmere is rough but beautiful, and together we will build something worthy of your grace. The ranch is modest but ours. I have enclosed your ticket. Come swiftly, I count the hours. Yours in faith and affection, Thomas Brennan. Except there was no Thomas Brennan. There was no ranch, there was no hours. There was only a third-class ticket west, a name that didn't exist in any land registry or church roll, and a fool in a wedding dress who'd believed every honeyed word because she'd been so desperate to believe in something. The conductor's whistle split the air, sharp, final. Horace appeared at her elbow, his face creased with the kind of concern that made Evelyn's throat close up. Miss Price, he said gently, that's the last train east tonight. If you're meaning to go back, I'm not. The words came out harder than she intended. Horace blinked, then nodded slowly, his mustache twitching. All right then, but you can't stay on this bench forever, miss. It ain't safe, and it ain't proper. Evelyn's smile felt like broken glass. No, I imagine it isn't. Horace sighed, the sound heavy with a kindness she didn't want. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small fold of bills. $3, maybe 4. Take this. There's a boarding house 2 streets over. Mrs. Kern's decent enough if you tell her I sent you. Evelyn stared at the money like it was a snake. I can't. You can, and you will. Horace pressed the bills into her palm, closing her fingers around them with a firmness that allowed no argument. Ain't charity, miss. Call it an investment. Dewsmere's small, but it's got need of good people. You strike me as good people. He tipped his hat and walked back toward the station house before Evelyn could find words to thank him or refuse him or crumble entirely under the weight of his decency. The train pulled away in a scream of steam and iron, and Evelyn sat alone in the gathering dark with $4 and no idea what came next. She should go back east. She knew that. There was an aunt in Philadelphia who'd take her in, along with a lifetime of I told you so and whispered gossip at church socials. There were friends who'd offer sympathy that tasted like judgment. There was a city that knew her as the girl who'd thrown away a teaching post and a respectable future to chase a phantom husband into the wilderness. Evelyn looked down at her ruined dress, at the careful stitching she'd done herself on the bodice, at the seed pearls she'd sewn by candlelight because she'd wanted to be beautiful for a man who'd never intended to see her at all. No, she couldn't go back to that. She wouldn't. The decision settled in her chest like a stone, heavy, cold, immovable. If she was already ruined, then let her be ruined here, where no one knew her name or her shame. Let her be ruined in a place where she could start over without the weight of old expectations pressing her into the ground. Evelyn stood, gripping her carpet bag, and walked toward the town proper. Dewsmere after dark was all sharp edges and soft light, oil lamps glowing in storefronts, the saloon spilling noise and laughter into the street, the distant bark of a dog, the creak of wagon wheels. She passed a mercantile with its windows full of dry goods, a blacksmith's forge gone cold, a church with a crooked steeple. No one looked at her. Or rather, everyone looked, but no one spoke. A woman in a wedding dress alone after dark told a story all on its own, and Dewsmere was the kind of town that knew better than to ask. Evelyn found the boarding house by the hand-painted sign swinging above the door, Kearns, Rooms, and Meals. The building was narrow, 2 stories of weathered clapboard with lace curtains in the windows and a front step worn smooth by years of boots. She knocked. The woman who answered was thin and sharp-eyed, her gray hair pinned in a bun so tight it looked painful. She took one look at Evelyn, dress, bag, face, and her expression shifted from suspicion to something softer. "Horace sent you." It wasn't a question. Evelyn nodded anyway. Figured he might. Mrs. Kearns stepped aside, holding the door open. "Come on, then. You look like you're about to keel over." The interior smelled like bread and lye soap. A narrow hallway led past a sitting room where 2 older men played checkers without looking up. Stairs climbed into shadow. Mrs. Kern gestured toward the back. "Kitchen's through there if you're hungry. Rooms are $1 a week, meals included if you take them before 8 in the morning and after 6 at night. No men above the first floor, no noise after 10, no trouble of any kind." Evelyn nodded, fumbling with the bills Horace had given her. Mrs. Kern waved her off. "Pay me Sunday. Right now you need food and sleep, and I'm not so heartless I can't see that." She studied Evelyn with a gaze that missed nothing. "What happened, girl?" Evelyn's voice cracked. She swallowed hard, forced the words out flat and empty. "I came for a wedding. There wasn't one." Mrs. Kern's mouth thinned. "Thomas Brennan?" Evelyn's head snapped up. "You know him?" "Know of him." Mrs. Kern's tone was bitter. "Con man, sends letters to lonely women back east, promises marriage and land, takes their money and disappears. You're the 3rd girl who's shown up here in 2 years looking for a husband that don't exist." The room tilted. Evelyn grabbed the doorframe, her knuckles white. "The others?" she whispered. "Went home." Mrs. Kern's voice softened. "Crying, mostly. Can't say I blame them." Evelyn closed her eyes. 3 girls, 3 ruined dreams, and she was just the latest in a line of fools. "You planning to stay?" Mrs. Kern asked. Evelyn opened her eyes. "I don't know." "Well," Mrs. Kern turned toward the kitchen, "you cannot know over supper. Come on." The kitchen was small and warm, the stove radiating heat into the room. Mrs. Kern ladled stew into a bowl, venison and potatoes, rich and thick, and set it on the table with a hunk of bread and a jar of butter. Evelyn sat. She ate. She didn't taste any of it. Somewhere between the 3rd and 4th spoonful, the tears finally came. Silent, relentless, soaking into the wedding dress that would never be worn for its intended purpose. Mrs. Kern didn't say anything. She just refilled the bowl and left a clean handkerchief on the table before disappearing into the hall. Evelyn cried until she was empty. Then she ate the rest of the stew, climbed the stairs to a narrow room with a single bed and a window that overlooked the street, and fell asleep still wearing $17 worth of shattered dreams. Morning came too bright and too loud. Evelyn woke to the sound of wagons rattling past, voices calling, a rooster crowing somewhere close enough to be offensive. Her body ached. 3 nights on a station bench, followed by 1 night on a mattress that was only slightly softer, had left her stiff and sore. She sat up slowly, taking stock. The wedding dress was a lost cause. The silk had wrinkled beyond saving, and the hem was stained dark with dirt and God knew what else from the station platform. Evelyn peeled it off with hands that shook only a little, folding it carefully out of habit before setting it aside. Her carpet bag held 2 practical dresses, one brown, one gray. A spare shirtwaist, undergarments, a brush, a testament, and the last $3 she owned in the world. She dressed in the brown, pinned her hair into a simple knot, and went downstairs. The kitchen was already bustling. Mrs. Kern worked at the stove while a younger woman, blonde, pretty, visibly pregnant, set plates on the long table. Two men sat eating in silence, their hats on their knees. Mrs. Kern glanced up. "You're up. Good. Sit." Evelyn sat. Breakfast was eggs, bacon, fried potatoes, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. The pregnant woman, introduced as Mrs. Kern's daughter, Alice, smiled at Evelyn with the kind of curiosity that wasn't quite pity, but wasn't quite friendly either. "You staying in town?" Alice asked. "I don't know yet," Evelyn said. "There's work if you need it," Mrs. Kern said, not looking up from the stove. "Laundry, mostly. Mending. The hotel takes on extra help when the cattle drives come through." Evelyn nodded, though the thought of staying in Dewsmere, of building a life from the wreckage of this humiliation, felt impossible. She finished her breakfast, thanked Mrs. Kern, and stepped outside into the morning. The town looked different in daylight, smaller, rougher, more real. The main street was wide and dusty, lined with businesses that leaned slightly to one side or the other. Wagons trundled past. Men in work clothes hauled crates. A dog trotted by with a stick in its mouth. Evelyn walked without direction, just moving because standing still felt like sinking. She passed the mercantile again. Open now, a bell chiming as a woman in a faded calico dress stepped inside. She passed the church with its crooked steeple. She passed a lawyer's office, a land agent, a saloon still closed and silent. And then she reached the train station. The bench where she'd spent 3 days was empty now, the wood still marked with faint impressions from where she'd sat. Evelyn stood there, staring at it, feeling the full weight of how close she'd come to giving up. "You still here?" She turned. Horace stood in the doorway of the station house, sleeves rolled up, a pencil tucked behind one ear. "Still here," Evelyn said. "Glad to hear it." He stepped out, squinting against the sun. "Mrs. Kern treating you all right?" "She's kind." "She's practical," Horace corrected, "but kind enough when it counts." He studied her for a moment, then nodded toward the bench. "You planning to sit there again, or you planning to do something?" Evelyn bristled. "I'm not sure what you think I should—" "Wasn't a criticism, miss." Horace's voice was mild. "Just an observation. You've got a choice now. Sit and wait for something to happen, or stand up and make something happen." He tipped his hat. "Either way, I wish you well." He went back inside, leaving Evelyn alone with her anger and her shame and the terrible, creeping realization that he was right. She couldn't sit here forever. She couldn't go back east. So what the hell was she supposed to do? The answer came in the form of a child. Evelyn didn't notice her at first, too lost in her own spiraling thoughts. But the girl must have been watching for a while, because when Evelyn finally turned, she found herself face to face with a pair of serious gray eyes set in a dirt-smudged face. The child was maybe 7 or 8, dressed in a shirt 3 sizes too big and boots that swallowed her skinny legs. Her hair was brown and tangled, braided haphazardly and tied with a piece of twine. She stood with her hands on her hips, studying Evelyn like she was a puzzle that needed solving. "You're the lady in the wedding dress," the girl said. It wasn't a question. Evelyn nodded anyway, too startled to do anything else. The girl tilted her head. "You got left behind." Yes." "That's bad." "Yes," Evelyn said again, because what else was there to say? The girl nodded, satisfied. Then she stepped closer, her expression shifting to something earnest and determined. "Do you got anywhere to go?" Evelyn hesitated. "Not exactly." "Do you got any money? A little? Do you know how to cook?" "Yes." "Good." The girl's face lit up like a lantern. "Then you should marry my daddy instead." Evelyn blinked. What?" "My daddy," the girl repeated, slower this time, like Evelyn was simple. "He needs help. I need a mama. You need a home. It's easy. I don't think—" "His name's Gideon Callahan, and he's got a ranch 3 miles out. He's real strong and he don't yell much, and he's only sad sometimes." The girl grabbed Evelyn's hand with both of hers. her grip surprisingly firm. "You should come meet him." "Sweetheart, I can't just—" "Why not?" The girl's gray eyes were wide and guileless. "You ain't got nowhere else to be." And that, God help her, was the truth. Evelyn opened her mouth to argue, to explain all the reasons why this was insane, but the girl was already tugging her toward the edge of town, chattering a mile a minute about horses and chickens and how her daddy made the best flapjacks, but only on Sundays. "What's your name?" Evelyn managed. "Maisie," the girl said. "Maisie Callahan. And you're going to love our ranch. It's got a creek and everything." Evelyn looked back toward the boarding house, toward the station, toward the town that had become her accidental prison. Then she looked down at Maisie, at this strange, bold child who'd decided with absolute certainty that Evelyn belonged somewhere, and felt something shift in her chest. Maybe it was madness. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was just the last, desperate gamble of a woman with nothing left to lose. "All right," Evelyn heard herself say. "I'll meet him." Maisie's grin could have lit the whole territory. She dragged Evelyn forward, still talking, and Evelyn let herself be led, away from the station, away from the town, away from every safe and sensible choice, toward a ranch she'd never seen and a man she'd never met, and a future that was probably just another kind of ruin. But at least this time, she'd be walking into it with her eyes open. The ranch was 3 miles out, but Maisie made it feel like 30. The child talked the entire way, a breathless, winding stream of information that jumped from topic to topic without warning. Evelyn learned that Maisie was 8 years old, that her mother had died 2 winters ago, that her daddy didn't smile much anymore, but he used to, that the ranch had 12 chickens and 2 horses and a cow named Beatrice, who was mean but gave good milk. She also learned that Maisie had been coming into town alone for weeks, watching the station, waiting for someone who looked like they needed saving as much as the Callahans did. "I knew you was the right one," Maisie said, skipping ahead on the dusty road. "Soon as I saw you sitting there all sad in that pretty dress, I told myself, Maisie, that lady needs us." Evelyn's throat tightened. "What if your father doesn't agree?" Maisie glanced back, her expression suddenly older than her years. "He will. He's just got to see you first." The road curved through open grassland, the horizon wide and empty, except for distant mountains that rose like broken teeth against the sky. The sun beat down without mercy, and Evelyn's dress clung to her back with sweat. She was about to suggest they stop for water when Maisie pointed ahead. "There, that's home." The ranch sat in a shallow valley, sheltered on 3 sides by low hills. The house was small, timber and stone, single-story, with a chimney leaking a thin line of smoke. A barn stood behind it, weathered gray, its doors hanging slightly crooked. A chicken coop, a garden plot, a corral with 2 horses watching their approach with lazy interest. It was modest. It was isolated. It was nothing like the grand homestead Thomas Brennan had described in his letters. And yet, Evelyn felt something settle in her chest as she looked at it. Something real. "Come on!" Maisie grabbed her hand again and pulled her toward the house. They crossed the yard, chickens scattering, dust rising, and Maisie shoved the door open without ceremony. "Daddy, I brought someone!" The interior was dim after the bright sunlight. Evelyn blinked, letting her eyes adjust, and slowly the room came into focus. It was a single large space, kitchen, dining, and sitting area all combined. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A table with mismatched chairs sat near the window. Shelves held chipped dishes and canned goods. Everything was clean but spare, functional but joyless. And standing near the fireplace, a coffee pot in one hand and suspicion written across his face, was Gideon Callahan. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway. His hair was dark brown, touched with gray at the temples, and his face was all hard angles, strong jaw, straight nose, deep-set eyes that were the same gray as Maisie's. He wore work clothes, flannel shirt, worn trousers, boots caked with dried mud, and he looked at Evelyn like she was a problem he hadn't asked for. "Maisie," he said slowly, "what did you do?" "I brought you a wife," Maisie announced, beaming. Gideon's expression didn't change. He set the coffee pot down very carefully, then looked at Evelyn, really looked, taking in the dusty dress, the carpet bag, the exhaustion she knew must be written all over her face. "No," he said. Maisie's smile faltered. "But, Daddy—" "No." His voice was firm but not unkind. He moved toward them, his gaze shifting to Evelyn. "Ma'am, I don't know what my daughter told you, but this isn't— we're not—" He stopped, jaw working. "You should go back to town." Evelyn lifted her chin. "Your daughter seems to think I'd be useful here." "My daughter," Gideon said flatly, "is 8 years old and don't understand how the world works." "I understand fine." Maisie's voice went shrill. "We need help, and she needs a home, and Mama would want—" "Maisie." The single word cut through the room like a blade. Gideon's face was stone. "Outside now." Maisie's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. She shot Evelyn one last desperate look. "Don't leave," and fled through the door. The silence that followed was suffocating. Gideon stared at the floor, his hands clenched at his sides. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and tired. "I'm sorry. She shouldn't have brought you out here. She's been talking about this. About finding someone to—" He stopped, shook his head. "It ain't right. I'll take you back to town myself." "Will you?" Evelyn set her bag down, her exhaustion crystallizing into something sharper. "Because your daughter seems to think you need help, and I'm standing here with nowhere to go. So maybe instead of deciding what's right for both of us, you could tell me what the situation actually is." Gideon's head snapped up, surprise flickering across his face. Evelyn held his gaze. "I came to Wyoming for a wedding that didn't exist. I have $4, no family, and no prospects. Your daughter found me at the train station and brought me here because she thought, rightly or wrongly, that we could help each other. So before you throw me back into town like I'm trash you didn't order, maybe you could at least hear me out." The silence stretched. Then slowly, Gideon's shoulders dropped. He looked at her, really looked, and something in his expression shifted. "You're the one Horace was talking about," he said quietly. "The girl in the wedding dress. Evelyn Price. Gideon Callahan." He gestured toward the table. "Sit. I'll make coffee." It wasn't agreement, but it wasn't refusal either. Evelyn sat. The coffee was strong and bitter, and Gideon drank his like medicine while Evelyn wrapped her hands around her cup and waited. Outside, Maisie's voice drifted through the window, singing to the chickens probably, because that's what Maisie did when she was upset. "My wife died 2 years ago," Gideon said finally. "Fever. Maisie was 6. I've been managing since, but it's—" He stopped, his jaw tight. "It's hard. The ranch, the house, the child. I can't do it all, and I can't afford to hire help. So Maisie decided to find you a wife. She's a determined child." There was something that might have been pride in his voice. "Takes after her mother that way." Evelyn studied him, the lines around his eyes, the weariness in his posture, the way his hands gripped the coffee cup like it was the only thing holding him upright. "What would you need?" she asked. "If you were to hire help, what would you need them to do?" Gideon looked at her warily. "Why?" "Because I can cook, clean, mend, and keep accounts. I taught school for 3 years before I—" She stopped, swallowed. "Before I made a mistake. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I'm not afraid of isolation. If you need help, I can provide it." "In exchange for what?" "A roof, meals, safety." Evelyn met his eyes. "Dignity." Something flickered in Gideon's expression. Understanding, maybe, or recognition. "This isn't a charity house," he said. "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for work." Gideon was quiet for a long time. Then he stood, moving to the window, staring out at the yard where Maisie was now chasing chickens in determined circles. "1 week," he said finally. "You can stay 1 week. Help with the house, the meals, the child. After that, we'll see." Relief washed over Evelyn so suddenly she had to grip the table to stay upright. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet." Gideon's voice was dry. "You haven't seen the work." He showed her the house, the bedroom he and Maisie shared, the loft where supplies were stored, the root cellar, the chicken coop, the barn. He spoke in short, clipped sentences, pointing out repairs that needed doing, problems that needed solving, 1,000 small things that had been neglected because there was only one of him and 24 hours in a day. Evelyn listened, cataloging every detail, already making mental lists. By the time they returned to the house, Maisie had reappeared, hovering in the doorway with hope written all over her face. "She's staying," Gideon said. "1 week." Maisie let out a whoop and launched herself at Evelyn, wrapping skinny arms around her waist. "I knew you'd stay. I knew it." Evelyn looked down at the child, at this fierce, strange little girl who'd decided to save her, and felt something crack open in her chest. 1 week, she said softly. But even then, she suspected it might be longer. That first night, Evelyn cooked supper. It wasn't anything fancy, just salt pork, beans, and cornbread, but she did it carefully, tasting as she went, adjusting the seasoning the way her mother had taught her years ago. She set the table with the chipped dishes, found a jar of preserves in the cellar, and called them to eat just as the sun was setting. Gideon and Maisie came in from the barn, their hands scrubbed but their clothes still dusty. They sat without speaking, and Evelyn served them in silence. Maisie ate like she was starving. Gideon ate slowly, his eyes on his plate, his expression unreadable. When they were finished, Evelyn cleared the dishes and started washing. Maisie dried, chattering about the chickens, and Gideon sat at the table with his coffee, watching them both like he couldn't quite figure out what had happened to his life. Evelyn didn't push. She just worked, cleaning, organizing, finding the rhythm of the house. When Maisie finally yawned, Gideon carried her to bed without a word. Evelyn heard their voices through the thin wall. Maisie's bright and hopeful, Gideon's low and tired. Then silence. Evelyn finished the dishes, banked the fire, and stood in the middle of the quiet house, feeling the full weight of the day settle over her. She'd gone from ruined bride to hired help in less than 12 hours. It should have felt like defeat. Instead, it felt like the first solid ground she'd stood on in weeks. She climbed the ladder to the loft, found a space between crates and sacks of grain, and made herself a bed with a spare blanket. It wasn't comfortable, but it was hers. Below she heard Gideon moving, boots on floorboards, the creak of a chair, the clink of a cup. Evelyn closed her eyes and let exhaustion take her. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The rooster woke Evelyn before dawn, its crow splitting the silence like an axe through wood. She lay still for a moment in the loft, disoriented by the unfamiliar shapes around her, crates, grain sacks, the slant of rough timber overhead. Then memory flooded back. The station, Maisie, the ranch, Gideon's gray eyes watching her like she was a storm he hadn't prepared for. 1 week. She had 1 week to prove she belonged here. Evelyn climbed down the ladder as quietly as she could, but the house was already stirring. Through the bedroom door, she heard Maisie's sleepy protest and Gideon's low response. The fire had burned down to embers overnight, so Evelyn knelt and coaxed it back to life, feeding it kindling until flames caught and spread. By the time Gideon emerged, hair damp, shirt button crooked, the coffee was ready, and the kitchen smelled like wood smoke and possibility. He stopped in the doorway, surprise flickering across his face before he could hide it. "Morning," Evelyn said. "Morning." He moved to the table, accepting the cup she handed him without meeting her eyes. "You didn't have to." "I know." She turned back to the stove where cornmeal mush was bubbling in the pot. "But I'm here, so I might as well be useful." Maisie tumbled out of the bedroom in a nightgown 3 sizes too big, her hair a wild tangle. "You're still here!" She launched herself at Evelyn with enough force to nearly knock the spoon from her hand. "Still here," Evelyn confirmed, steadying the child. "Now sit. Breakfast is almost ready." They ate in near silence, Gideon focused on his plate, Maisie sneaking glances between them like she was trying to will them into conversation. When Gideon finally pushed back from the table, he looked at Evelyn with something that might have been reluctance. "I've got fence work today. Maisie can show you where things are." "I can help with the fence," Evelyn said. Gideon's eyebrows rose. "It's hard work." "I imagine most work here is." For a moment she thought he'd refuse. Then he nodded once, sharp. "Wear something you don't mind ruining. We leave in 20 minutes." Evelyn had nothing that wasn't already half ruined, but she changed into her gray dress anyway, the hem already frayed from train travel, and tied her hair back with a strip of cloth. When she came downstairs, Maisie was dressed, and Gideon was loading tools into a wagon hitched to one of the horses. "Can I come?" Maisie asked. "You're coming," Gideon said. "Someone's got to keep an eye on Miss Price." "Evelyn," she corrected. "You can call me Evelyn." Gideon glanced at her, something unreadable crossing his face. "Evelyn, then." The way he said it, careful, like he was testing the weight of her name, made something flutter in Evelyn's chest that she firmly ignored. They rode out in the wagon, Maisie wedged between them, pointing out landmarks with the authority of a seasoned guide. "That's where Mama's buried," she said, gesturing toward a low hill with a single wooden cross visible against the sky. "Daddy planted wildflowers, but they ain't come up yet." Gideon's hands tightened on the reins, but he said nothing. Evelyn looked at the cross and felt the shape of their grief, quiet, enormous, still raw around the edges. The fence line ran along the eastern boundary of the property, separating Callahan land from open range. Several posts had rotted through, and the wire sagged dangerously in places. Gideon jumped down and started unloading tools, post hole digger, hammer, wire cutters, new posts already stripped and ready. "You ever done this before?" he asked Evelyn. "No." "Then watch first, learn second, work third." He pulled on leather gloves and attacked the first rotted post with the efficiency of long practice. Evelyn watched. She learned. And when Gideon moved to the second post, she picked up the post hole digger and started on the third. The work was brutal. The ground was hard-packed dirt and rocks, and every strike of the digger sent shocks up through her arms into her shoulders. Sweat soaked through her dress within minutes. Her hands, soft from 3 years of teaching, began to blister almost immediately. She didn't stop. Gideon glanced over once, his expression skeptical. Then he went back to his own work without comment. They worked through the morning in near silence, broken only by Maisie's running commentary and the rhythmic sounds of labor, metal against earth, hammer against wood, the creak of wire being stretched tight. The sun climbed higher, merciless and bright, and Evelyn's back began to scream in protest. She ignored it. At midday, Maisie unpacked the lunch Gideon had thrown together. Hard cheese, bread, water from a canteen that tasted like metal and dust. They sat in the shade of the wagon, eating without talking, too tired for conversation. Evelyn's hands were bleeding through the makeshift cloth wrap she'd torn from her petticoat. Gideon noticed, his gaze dropping to her palms, then back to her face. "You should stop," he said. "I'm fine." "You're bleeding." "So are you." She nodded at the scrape across his forearm, where the wire had caught him. Gideon's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "Stubborn." "Practical," Evelyn corrected. Maisie giggled through a mouthful of bread, and something in the air shifted, some small easing of tension that felt like progress. They finished the fence work by late afternoon, 8 new posts planted and braced, the wire stretched taut and secure. Evelyn's entire body felt like one enormous bruise, but when she looked back at the line they'd repaired, she felt something close to pride. Gideon loaded the tools without speaking, but when he offered her a hand up into the wagon, there was something in his eyes that looked almost like respect. The ride back was quieter. Maisie dozed against Evelyn's shoulder, and the landscape rolled past in shades of gold and brown. Evelyn let herself relax for the first time all day, feeling the ache in her muscles settle into something almost pleasant, the good kind of tired that came from work that mattered. "You didn't have to push that hard," Gideon said finally. Evelyn looked at him. "Yes, I did." He studied her for a long moment. "Why?" "Because I don't have anywhere else to go." The honesty came easier than she expected. "Because your daughter believes I can help. Because I need to prove I'm worth keeping around." She paused. "And because I made a promise to myself that I wouldn't be helpless anymore." Gideon's jaw worked. He looked like he wanted to say something, but instead he just nodded and turned his attention back to the road. When they reached the ranch, Evelyn climbed down with legs that barely held her weight. Maisie woke up enough to stumble toward the house, yawning, and Gideon started unhitching the wagon. "I'll make supper," Evelyn said. "You don't have to." "I know, but I will anyway." She headed for the house before he could argue. Inside, she found the kitchen in the same state of benign neglect that seemed to characterize the whole ranch, clean enough to be functional, but joyless in its efficiency. Evelyn set about changing that. She found potatoes in the cellar, onions starting to sprout, a jar of canned tomatoes. She made a stew, thick and hearty, and baked biscuits in the Dutch oven that came out golden and steaming. When Gideon came in, he stopped in the doorway and stared. "It smells like—" He didn't finish, but the expression on his face said everything. "Like someone lives here," Evelyn supplied gently. His throat worked. "Yeah." They ate together at the table, Maisie chattering, Gideon silent, Evelyn letting the exhaustion of the day settle over her like a blanket. When Maisie started nodding off between bites, Gideon carried her to bed again, and Evelyn heard their goodnight ritual through the wall, soft voices, a song hummed off-key, the creak of a mattress. She washed the dishes slowly, giving them privacy, and when Gideon emerged, he found her wiping down the table. "You should rest," he said. "So should you." "I've got ledgers to go through. Books don't balance themselves." Evelyn straightened, ignoring the protest of her spine. "I could help with that. I kept accounts at the school." Gideon hesitated, then gestured toward a battered desk in the corner. "Have at it. Numbers make my head hurt." The ledgers were a disaster. Months of entries scrawled in barely legible handwriting, receipts stuffed between pages, calculations that didn't add up. Evelyn pulled the nearest lamp closer and started sorting, her teacher's instinct for organization taking over. After an hour, she had a clearer picture. The ranch was barely breaking even. Expenses for feed, repairs, and supplies ate up most of the income from selling cattle and horses. There was almost nothing left over, and one bad season would sink them completely. "It's not good," she said finally. Gideon, slumped in his chair with cold coffee at his elbow, just nodded. "I know. But it's not impossible." Evelyn pointed to a column. "You're underselling the horses, and there's no income listed from the chickens. If we—" She stopped, catching herself. "If you sold eggs in town, that's small but steady money." Gideon sat up straighter. "We?" Evelyn felt heat climb her cheeks. "I meant— No, you were right the first time." He leaned forward, studying the ledger with new attention. "What else?" They worked until midnight, Evelyn suggesting, Gideon listening, both of them too tired to maintain the careful distance they'd been keeping all day. By the time they finally stopped, there was a tentative plan, small changes that might add up to survival if they could execute them. "You're good at this," Gideon said. "I like things that make sense." Evelyn closed the ledger carefully. "Numbers are honest. They don't lie or make promises they can't keep." Gideon's gaze sharpened. "The man who brought you here, Thomas Brennan, he made promises." "He made fantasies. Evelyn's voice was flat. "I was stupid enough to believe them." "That doesn't make you stupid. Makes him a bastard." The vehemence in Gideon's tone surprised her. Evelyn looked up and found him watching her with something that looked almost like anger, but not at her. "He's done it before," Gideon continued. "Horace told me. Other women, same lies. Someone should—" He stopped, jaw clenched. "Someone should what?" "Nothing. It doesn't matter." But his hands were fists on the table. Evelyn studied him, this hard, quiet man who'd lost his wife and was drowning in work and grief, but still had room for anger on behalf of women he'd never met. "Thank you," she said softly. Gideon blinked. "For what?" "For being decent." Something passed between them then, an understanding too fragile to name, but real enough to feel. Then Gideon pushed back from the table, the moment breaking. "You should sleep. Tomorrow won't be easier." Evelyn climbed to the loft and lay down in her makeshift bed, every muscle screaming. But when she finally slept, she dreamed not of train stations or phantom grooms, but of fence lines running straight and true under a wide Wyoming sky. The days that followed fell into a rhythm: hard work, simple meals, quiet evenings. Evelyn threw herself into the ranch with the fervor of someone who'd been drowning and finally found solid ground. She mended clothes that had gone too long neglected, organized the kitchen until every pot and pan had a proper place, weeded the garden, and coaxed it back toward productivity. Maisie shadowed her everywhere, chattering endlessly, her presence both exhausting and oddly comforting. The child had no sense of personal space and even less sense of propriety. She asked questions about everything, declared opinions with absolute certainty, and climbed into Evelyn's lap at every opportunity like a starved for affection cat. "Mama used to braid my hair," Maisie said one morning, watching Evelyn work. Evelyn's hands stilled. "Would you like me to braid yours?" Maisie's face lit up. "Yes!" So Evelyn sat on the porch step with Maisie between her knees, carefully working through the tangles until she could plait the brown hair into two neat braids. Maisie sat perfectly still, barely breathing, like she was afraid any movement might break the spell. When Evelyn tied off the second braid, Maisie reached up to touch them, wonder on her face. "You did it just like Mama." Evelyn's throat tightened. "I'm sure she did it better." "She did it different." Maisie turned around, her gray eyes serious. "But this is good too." From the doorway, Gideon watched them without speaking, something raw and complicated written across his face. The week passed. Evelyn counted the days with a mixture of hope and dread. Gideon had said 1 week, 7 days to prove her worth. On the morning of the 8th day, she woke early and lay in the loft, heart pounding, waiting for him to tell her it was time to go back to town. Instead, when she climbed down, she found him at the table with coffee and a question. "Can you ride?" Evelyn blinked. "A horse?" "Unless you know how to ride something else." "I've ridden before. Not well, but good enough." Gideon stood. "I need to check the cattle in the north pasture. Maisie's got school lessons, and I'd rather not leave you both alone all day." He paused. "If you're staying, that is." Evelyn's heart kicked hard against her ribs. "Am I? Staying?" Gideon looked at her, really looked, the way he had that first day, but with less suspicion and more something else. "Do you want to?" "Yes." The answer came immediately, no hesitation, and Evelyn realized she meant it completely. This ranch, this strange makeshift family, this life built from necessity and held together with work, she wanted it with a fierceness that surprised her. Gideon nodded slowly. "Then you're staying." Maisie, who'd been eavesdropping from the bedroom, let out a whoop and came barreling out to wrap herself around both of them in a tangle of nightgown and bony limbs. "I knew it," she crowed. "I knew you'd stay." Evelyn laughed. Actually laughed, and felt something in her chest that had been clenched tight for weeks finally start to loosen. 2 hours later, she was on a horse named Rosie, a placid mare with more patience than speed, following Gideon into the hills. The riding came back slowly, her body remembering the rhythm even as her thighs protested the unfamiliar strain. They rode in silence for a long time, the only sounds the creak of leather and the steady plod of hooves. The land rolled out around them in endless waves of grass and sage, and the sky stretched overhead so vast and blue it made Evelyn's eyes hurt. "It's beautiful," she said finally. Gideon glanced at her, surprise flickering across his face like he'd forgotten beauty was something worth noticing. "Yeah, it is." They found the cattle scattered across a wide meadow, grazing peacefully. Gideon counted them methodically, checking for injuries or signs of disease, and Evelyn watched and learned. When they were satisfied everything was well, they sat on a low ridge and shared the water and biscuits Evelyn had packed. "Why ranching?" Evelyn asked. Gideon was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "My father was a rancher, his father before him. I never wanted anything else." He stared out at the cattle. "Met Mary at a church social in Cheyenne. She was a town girl, dresses and parties and friends calling every afternoon. But she said yes anyway. Came out here and learned to love it." His voice roughened. "Or she learned to love me enough that the land didn't matter." Evelyn waited, letting the silence hold space for his grief. "She was good at everything," Gideon continued. "Cooking, gardening, raising Maisie. She made this place feel like it meant something. After she died, I kept working because that's what you do, but it stopped feeling like home, started feeling like just survival. And Maisie's the reason I get up every morning." He said it simply, like it was the truest thing he knew. "But she needs more than I know how to give. She needs—" He gestured helplessly. "She needs someone who can teach her things, who can braid her hair and tell her stories and not just feed her and keep her alive." "You're doing better than you think," Evelyn said. Gideon looked at her, his gray eyes intense. "Maybe, but it's not enough, and I know it." They rode back as the afternoon sun slanted long across the grass. When they reached the ranch, Maisie came running out, a slate in her hands covered with careful letters. "Look, I did my ABCs twice." Evelyn dismounted, less gracefully than she would have liked, and examined the slate with appropriate seriousness. "These are very good. Can you write your whole name?" Maisie's face scrunched in concentration. "Maisie. Close. It's Maisie. Evelyn took the chalk and wrote it out. "See? The I comes before the E." "That's stupid," Maisie declared, but she copied it carefully anyway. That night, after Maisie was in bed, Evelyn and Gideon sat at the table with the ledgers spread between them. They were working through a plan to sell 4 horses at the autumn market when a knock rattled the door. Hard, insistent, all wrong for the late hour. Gideon tensed immediately. He rose, motioning for Evelyn to stay back, and opened the door with one hand resting on the knife at his belt. A man stood on the porch, tall, lean, dressed in town clothes that looked expensive even in the dim light. His face was angular and sharp, his eyes cold, and when he smiled, it didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "Callahan," he said. "Been a while." Gideon's whole body went rigid. "Briggs, what do you want?" "Just came by neighborly-like to remind you about that loan payment." The man, Briggs, leaned against the doorframe with calculated ease. "Coming due end of next month. Figured you might need reminding, seeing as how you've been late before." "I'll have it? Will you?" Briggs's gaze slid past Gideon, landing on Evelyn. His smile widened. "Got yourself some help, I see. That the mail-order bride everyone's talking about?" Evelyn felt ice slide down her spine. Gideon stepped sideways, blocking Briggs's view. "That's none of your concern. Everything in this territory is my concern, Callahan. Bank sees to that." Briggs pushed off the doorframe. "End of next month. Don't make me come collect it personally." He walked away into the darkness, whistling, and Gideon stood frozen until the sound faded completely. Then he shut the door and locked it with shaking hands. "Who was that?" Evelyn asked. "Harlan Briggs. Works for the bank. Calls himself a loan officer, but he's more like a vulture." Gideon's voice was hollow. "I borrowed money 2 years ago to buy cattle. Been paying it back, but..." He stopped, pressing his palms against his eyes. "I'm behind. And Briggs doesn't give extensions." "How far behind?" 3 months. Evelyn's stomach dropped. "How much do you owe?" Gideon told her. The number was devastating, more than they could possibly raise in a month, more than the ranch could produce even in a good season. "What happens if you can't pay?" But Evelyn already knew. "He forecloses, takes the ranch." Gideon's voice cracked. "We lose everything." Evelyn looked around the small house, at the table they'd shared, the ledgers they'd worked over, the bedroom where Maisie slept dreaming of a future that suddenly felt desperately fragile. "Then we find a way to pay him," she said. Gideon laughed, a raw, broken sound. "With what? We barely make enough to eat." "I don't know yet." Evelyn stood, her mind already racing through possibilities. "But we have a month. That's time enough to try." "Evelyn, no." She cut him off, her voice fierce. "I didn't come all this way and work this hard just to watch you give up. We'll find a way." Gideon stared at her like she was speaking a language he didn't understand. Then, slowly, something shifted in his expression, surprise giving way to something that looked almost like hope. "All right," he said quietly. "We'll try." But as Evelyn climbed to the loft that night, she couldn't shake the image of Briggs's cold smile or the hollow sound of Gideon's voice when he'd said, "We lose everything." 1 month, 30 days to save a ranch, a family, a future that was only just beginning to feel possible. Evelyn lay in the darkness and made a promise to herself. She would find a way. She had to. Because for the first time since stepping off that train in her ruined wedding dress, she had something worth fighting for. Evelyn woke before dawn the next morning with a plan already forming in her mind. Fragile and desperate, but a plan nonetheless. She climbed down from the loft as quietly as she could. But Gideon was already awake, slumped at the table with his head in his hands and last night's cold coffee sitting untouched beside him. He looked up when she entered, and the exhaustion on his face was so raw it made her chest ache. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked. "Haven't slept worth a damn since Mary died." He said it matter-of-factly, like insomnia was just another chore on his endless list. But last night was worse. Evelyn moved to the stove and started rebuilding the fire. "We need to make a list. Everything the ranch can produce, everything we can sell, every possibility, no matter how small." "Evelyn, I know you think it's hopeless, but I'm not giving up, so you might as well help me figure it out." She said it without looking at him, keeping her hands busy because stillness felt like surrender. Behind her, Gideon was quiet for a long moment. Then she heard the scrape of a chair and the sound of him pulling the ledgers toward him. "All right, let's see what we've got." They worked through breakfast, Evelyn cooking with one hand and calculating with the other, Gideon writing lists in his cramped handwriting while Maisie ate her porridge and watched them with worried eyes that were far too old for 8 years. The accounting was brutal. They had 4 horses they could potentially sell, but the autumn market was still 6 weeks away, and Briggs wanted his money in 4. The cattle weren't ready. They'd lose money selling them underweight. The chickens produced enough eggs for the house with maybe 2 dozen extra per week, which would bring in pennies, not dollars. "What about the preserves?" Evelyn pointed to the rows of jars lining the cellar shelves. "Mary made these?" Gideon nodded, his throat working. "She put up everything from the garden, tomatoes, beans, pickles, jam. We've been eating through them, but there's still—" He stopped, looked at Evelyn. "You think we could sell them?" "In town, maybe. Women pay good money for quality preserves, especially ones they don't have to make themselves." Evelyn's mind was already racing. "How many jars do we have?" They went down to the cellar together, Maisie trailing behind with a lamp. The shelves held more than Evelyn had hoped, at least 60 jars of various sizes, each one labeled in Mary's careful script. Tomatoes, green beans, peach preserves, strawberry jam, bread and butter pickles. Gideon reached out and touched one of the labels, his fingers trembling slightly. "She'd be glad," Evelyn said softly, "that they're helping. She'd be furious I let things get this bad in the first place." But there was no heat in his voice, just grief and something that might have been gratitude. They loaded 30 jars into crates and hitched up the wagon. Gideon drove with Evelyn beside him and Maisie wedged between them, and they made the 3-mile journey to Dusmere in silence, heavy with hope and dread mixed together. The town was busier than Evelyn remembered. Wagons rattling past, men hauling freight, women moving between shops with baskets over their arms. Gideon pulled up in front of the mercantile, and Evelyn felt her stomach clench with nerves. "Let me do the talking," she said. Gideon raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" "Women buy preserves from women. Trust me." The mercantile was dim and crowded, every surface covered with goods. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She looked up when they entered, and her gaze went immediately to the crate in Gideon's arms. "Mrs. Brenner," Gideon said, nodding. "Callahan." The woman's voice was crisp. "What brings you to town?" Evelyn stepped forward before Gideon could answer. "Mrs. Brenner, I'm Evelyn Price. I'm helping out at the Callahan Ranch, and we have some preserves we'd like to sell. Top quality, put up last summer from their own garden." Mrs. Brenner's eyes narrowed. "You're the girl from the train station, the one who got left behind." Heat flooded Evelyn's face, but she kept her voice steady. "Yes, ma'am. I am." Mrs. Brenner came around the counter and examined the jars with the practiced eye of someone who knew quality when she saw it. She held one up to the light, checking the seal, then opened it and sniffed. "Mary Callahan's work." "Yes, ma'am." Mary knew what she was doing. Mrs. Brenner closed the jar carefully. "These are good. I'll give you 20 cents a jar." Evelyn's heart sank. 20 cents would bring in $6, nowhere near enough. "Mrs. Brenner, with respect, these are worth at least 30 cents each. The seals are perfect, the quality is excellent, and you know as well as I do that women in this town will pay 50 cents for preserves they don't have to make themselves." Mrs. Brenner's eyebrows rose. "You've got nerve. I'll give you that." "I've got need," Evelyn corrected, "and I've got a product worth buying. 30 cents a jar, and we'll bring you more next week." For a long moment, Mrs. Brenner just stared at her. Then, slowly, a smile creased her face. 25 cents, final offer. 28, and you can advertise them as Mary Callahan's original recipe. Mrs. Brenner laughed, a sharp bark of sound. Deal, but I want 40 jars next week, not 30, and if they don't sell, you're taking them back. They'll sell, Evelyn said with more confidence than she felt. They walked out with $7.50, and Gideon looked at Evelyn like she'd just performed a miracle. "Where'd you learn to bargain like that?" "My mother ran a boarding house. She taught me that everything's negotiable if you're brave enough to ask." Evelyn tucked the money into her pocket, already calculating. $7.50 isn't nearly enough, but it's a start. Over the next 2 weeks, they fell into a desperate rhythm. Evelyn spent her mornings in the garden, coaxing the last of the summer vegetables into one final harvest. She picked tomatoes until her fingers were stained red, pulled beans until her back screamed, dug potatoes until her hands bled through the cloth wrappings. Maisie helped, sorting, washing, learning, and in the afternoons while Gideon worked the ranch, they processed everything into preserves. The kitchen became a factory. Jars boiled, vegetables chopped, sugar and vinegar and spices measured with the precision Evelyn had once used for teaching arithmetic. She worked from Mary's recipes but adapted them where she could, stretching ingredients, adding wild herbs from the hillsides, creating new combinations that might catch a customer's eye. Maisie stood on a stool beside her, stirring pots and asking endless questions. And somewhere in the heat and chaos, Evelyn realized she'd stopped thinking of this as temporary work. She'd started thinking of it as hers, this kitchen, this child, this fight to save something that mattered. Gideon watched them work with an expression Evelyn couldn't quite read. In the evenings after Maisie was in bed, he helped her clean and organize, and they'd fall into conversation, careful at first, then gradually more honest. He told her about the ranch, about his father who'd broken horses, and his mother who'd died when he was 12. She told him about Philadelphia, about teaching children who'd looked at her with bored eyes, about the loneliness that had made Thomas Brennan's letters feel like salvation. "I should have known better," she said one night, scrubbing a pot with more force than necessary. "I'm educated. I'm not some foolish girl, but I wanted so badly to believe in something that I ignored every warning sign." "That doesn't make you foolish," Gideon said quietly. "Makes you human." Evelyn looked at him, at this man who'd been a stranger 3 weeks ago and now felt like the only person who truly saw her, and felt something shift in her chest that she wasn't ready to name. By the end of the second week, they'd sold 90 jars of preserves and earned $23. They'd also sold 2 horses at below-market prices to a rancher passing through, adding another $40 to their total. Gideon took on extra work breaking horses for neighbors, dangerous work that left him bruised and exhausted, but brought in $15 more. Evelyn sold eggs door to door in town, swallowed her pride, and asked Mrs. Kern if there was mending work available. The money came in pieces, small, hard-won, never enough. With 1 week left before the payment was due, they sat at the table and counted everything they had, $78.35. They needed $120. The silence in the room was suffocating. "We're not going to make it," Gideon said finally, his voice hollow. "We still have a week. Evelyn." He looked at her with eyes full of defeat. "There's nothing left to sell, nothing left to try. We're going to lose the ranch." Maisie, who'd been coloring on her slate in the corner, suddenly stood up. Her face was white, her eyes too bright. "Daddy, no!" "Maisie, sweetheart." "You can't let them take it." Her voice cracked. "Mama's buried here. This is home. You can't—" She broke into sobs and Gideon pulled her into his arms, his own face crumbling. Evelyn watched them hold each other and felt her heart break into pieces. That night, she lay in the loft and stared at the dark ceiling, her mind spinning through impossible options. They could ask for more time, but Briggs wouldn't give it. They could take out another loan, but no bank would lend to someone already drowning. They could sell more horses, but they'd already sold the only ones ready for market. There was no way forward. Evelyn closed her eyes and felt despair wash over her like a flood. And then, like a whisper from another life, she remembered. The letter. The letter that had arrived 3 days before she'd left Philadelphia. The letter she'd shoved into the bottom of her carpet bag because she'd been too focused on her fantasy wedding to care about anything else. Evelyn sat up so fast she nearly hit her head on the rafters. She scrambled down the ladder, grabbed her bag from the corner where she'd left it, and dumped everything onto the floor. There, beneath her spare dress and her mother's testament, was the envelope, still sealed, the return address written in her aunt's careful script. Her hands shook as she opened it. Dearest Evelyn, I write with unexpected news. Your uncle's estate has finally been settled after 2 years of legal entanglements. As his sole niece, you are entitled to a portion of the inheritance. The amount is $127.50, which I have arranged to be held in trust at the Philadelphia Savings Bank until you claim it. I realize this is not a fortune, but I hope it provides some security. Please write when you receive this so I know you are well. Your loving aunt, Margaret Evelyn, read it twice, then a third time, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. $127.50, exactly enough to save the ranch, with a few dollars left over. She sat on the floor surrounded by her scattered belongings and started laughing, a wild, half-hysterical sound that she had to muffle in her hand so she wouldn't wake the whole house. An inheritance. She had an inheritance. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor after all. Morning couldn't come fast enough. Evelyn was dressed and pacing by the time Gideon emerged from the bedroom, and she shoved the letter into his hands before he could even pour coffee. Read this. He read. His face went blank with shock, then pale, then something Evelyn couldn't identify. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. This is... His voice broke. Evelyn, this is your money. It's our money, she corrected. It saves the ranch. No. Gideon set the letter down carefully. You can't. This is your inheritance, your future, my choice. Evelyn's voice was firm. Gideon, I don't have anyone back east waiting for me. No family that wants me, no prospects, no life worth going back to. But here, she gestured around the small kitchen. Here I have work that matters, a child who needs me, a chance to build something real instead of chasing fantasies. Evelyn, let me finish. She took a breath, steadying herself. I'm not giving you charity. I'm making an investment. We use this money to pay Briggs, and in return you make me a partner. My name goes on the deed alongside yours. We build this ranch together, equally. Gideon stared at her like she'd grown a second head. You want to be partners? I want to be equals. Evelyn held his gaze. I want to know that if I pour my life into this place, I won't wake up one day and find myself with nothing because some man decided I was disposable. I want legal protection and a real stake in what we're building. For a long moment, Gideon didn't speak. Then, slowly, he nodded. All right, partners? He held out his hand and Evelyn shook it, his grip warm and calloused and solid as bedrock. We'll need a lawyer to draw up the papers, he said. Then let's go to town. They left Maisie with Mrs. Kern for the afternoon and went straight to the lawyer's office, a cramped room above the mercantile where a thin man with spectacles listened to their request without judgment and drew up a partnership agreement on the spot. Gideon and Evelyn both signed, their signatures side by side, and Evelyn felt something settle in her chest that felt like safety. Then they went to the bank. The building was the nicest in Deucemeyer, brick and stone with brass fixtures that gleamed even in the dim interior. A clerk directed them to a private office where Harlan Briggs sat behind a mahogany desk, looking every inch the predator Evelyn remembered from his late-night visit. Callahan, he said, leaning back in his leather chair. Come to beg for more time. Come to pay what's owed. Gideon's voice was flat. Briggs's smile faltered. You don't have the money. I do now. Gideon placed the partnership agreement on the desk, followed by the bank draft they had arranged for the inheritance money. $120. Everything I owe, plus the late fees your bank charges like highway robbery. Briggs stared at the papers like they were snakes. Then his gaze slid to Evelyn, and understanding dawned across his face, cold and ugly. So you did marry the mail-order bride. His voice dripped contempt. Bought yourself a wife to save the ranch. How romantic. Miss Price is my business partner. Gideon said quietly. And you do well to speak about her with respect. Partner, Briggs laughed. Is that what you're calling it? Because from where I sit, it looks like a desperate man taking advantage of a desperate woman. Evelyn felt rage ignite in her chest, but before she could speak, Gideon leaned forward, slow and deliberate, his whole body radiating controlled fury. Take the money, Briggs, close the account. And don't you ever set foot on my property again unless you want to see just how desperate I can get. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Briggs's smile disappeared, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. He pulled the papers toward him, made a show of checking the bank draft, then called for the clerk to process the payment. 10 minutes later, they walked out with a receipt marking the loan paid in full and Gideon's ranch free and clear. They made it halfway down the street before Gideon stopped, turned to Evelyn, and pulled her into an embrace so sudden and fierce it knocked the breath from her lungs. Thank you, he whispered against her hair. Thank you. Evelyn stood rigid for a moment, shocked by the contact, by the raw emotion in his voice, then slowly let herself lean into him. He smelled like leather and wood smoke and something indefinably him, and for just a moment she let herself feel safe in a way she hadn't felt since her parents died. Then Gideon pulled back, his face flushed, his eyes avoiding hers. Sorry, I shouldn't have... It's all right. Evelyn's voice came out softer than she intended. We just saved your home. I think that warrants a hug. He looked at her then, really looked, and something passed between them that was too complicated to name. Then Maisie's voice shattered the moment, the child barreling down the street toward them, with Mrs. Kern huffing behind her. Did you do it? Did you save the ranch? We did it, Gideon confirmed, catching his daughter as she launched herself at him. Maisie let out a whoop that probably carried all the way back to Philadelphia, and Mrs. Kern smiled, a rare, genuine expression that softened her whole face. Congratulations, she said simply. Then to Evelyn, you're good for them. Don't forget that. They celebrated that night with a supper that was almost festive. Evelyn made a roast chicken with all the trimmings, and Gideon pulled out a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for some unnamed occasion. Maisie got a thimbleful mixed with water and declared it disgusting, which made them all laugh until their sides hurt. Later, after Maisie was asleep, Evelyn and Gideon sat on the porch and watched the stars emerge one by one across the vast Wyoming sky. I never thought, Gideon started, then stopped, started again. I never thought I'd feel hopeful again. Not after Mary. Not after everything fell apart. You did the hard part, Evelyn said. You kept going when it would have been easier to quit. So did you. Gideon looked at her, his gray eyes catching starlight. You got off that train with nothing but a ruined dress and pride, and instead of running home, you stayed and fought. That takes more courage than I think you know. Evelyn felt heat climb her cheeks and was grateful for the darkness hiding it. I didn't have anywhere else to go. Maybe not at first, but you stayed after you had the money. You could have taken that inheritance and built a new life anywhere. Instead, you chose this. He gestured toward the ranch spread out before them, the house, the barn, the land rolling away into shadow. You chose us. I chose a future worth having, Evelyn corrected, but her voice wavered on the words and they both heard it. Gideon was quiet for a long time. Then, I can't promise it'll be easy. The ranch is hard work, and this life, it's lonely sometimes, isolated. There'll be rough winters and failed crops and probably 100 other disasters I haven't thought of yet. I know. But if you're willing to stay, if you're willing to keep being partners, then I promise I'll never take you for granted. I'll work as hard as you do, and I'll respect your voice in every decision, and I'll... He stopped, swallowed hard. I'll try to be worthy of the faith you've put in this place. Evelyn looked at him, at this complicated, grieving man who'd let her into his life when he had every reason to stay closed off, and felt her heart do something dangerous and foolish and utterly inevitable. I'm staying, she said, for as long as you'll have me. Gideon's hand found hers in the darkness, his fingers threading through hers with a gentleness that made her throat close. They sat like that for a long time, not speaking, just existing together under the endless sky. And Evelyn realized that somewhere between fence posts and preserves and desperate bargaining, she'd stopped running from her old life and started building a new one. It wasn't the life she'd imagined when she'd boarded that train in her wedding dress. It was better, because it was real, and it was hers, and it was worth every hard-won moment. But as Evelyn lay in her loft bed that night, Gideon's touch still warm on her skin, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered a warning. Nothing this good lasted without being tested. She ignored it, pushed it down, let exhaustion take her. She'd deal with whatever came next when it arrived. For now, she'd take this one perfect moment of peace. The warning Evelyn had ignored came exactly 1 week later, dressed in a tailored suit and riding a horse too fine for honest ranch work. She was in the garden pulling the last of the carrots when Maisie came running from the house, her face pale and her voice pitched high with alarm. "There's a man here! A fancy man asking for you!" Evelyn straightened, dirt falling from her hands, and felt her stomach drop even before she turned toward the house. Standing on the porch with the easy confidence of someone who'd never been told no was a man she'd spent 4 weeks trying to forget. Travis Hart. Not Thomas Brennan, there had never been a Thomas Brennan. Just Travis Hart, confidence man and liar, looking exactly as he had in the single photograph he'd sent her. Tall and handsome with golden hair and blue eyes that probably made sensible women forget themselves. He smiled when he saw her, the expression warm and practiced. "Evelyn, my God, I've been so worried." The sound of her name in his mouth made her skin crawl. Evelyn walked toward the house slowly, keeping her voice level even as her heart kicked against her ribs. "You need to leave. Darling, please, let me explain. Don't call me that." She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at him with all the contempt she could muster. "You're a liar and a thief, and you need to get off this property before I fetch the shotgun." Travis's smile faltered, then reformed itself into something that looked almost like hurt. "I know you're angry. You have every right to be. But if you'll just give me a chance to explain." "Explain what?" "How you swindled me and God knows how many other women. How you took money for a wedding that was never going to happen." Evelyn's voice was shaking now, rage and humiliation mixing together until she couldn't tell them apart. "There's nothing you could say that would make any of this acceptable." "I can explain all of it." Travis descended the steps, moving into her space with the kind of presumption that came from years of charming his way out of consequences. "There were complications, business matters that required my immediate attention. I fully intended to meet you, to honor my promises, but circumstances beyond my control." "Stop lying!" Evelyn cut him off, her voice hard. "I know what you are. The whole town knows what you are. You're a con man who preys on lonely women, and I was foolish enough to fall for it." Behind Travis, the door opened and Gideon stepped out. He moved with the deadly calm of a man who'd spent years handling unpredictable horses, and when he spoke his voice was flat and cold. "She told you to leave." Travis turned, his expression shifting from wounded suitor to something sharper. "And you are?" "Gideon Callahan, this is my ranch." Gideon's hand rested casually on his belt, inches from the knife he always carried. "You've got 30 seconds to get back on that horse before I help you onto it." "I'm not here to cause trouble." Travis held up his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm just trying to talk to my fiancée." "I am not your fiancée," Evelyn said through clenched teeth. "I never was. You lied about everything, your name, your ranch, all of it. There were reasons. 30 seconds is up." Gideon moved down the steps, and something in his posture made Travis take an involuntary step backward. For a moment, Evelyn thought Travis would actually leave. Then his gaze landed on Maisie, who'd crept to the doorway to watch, and his expression shifted into something calculating. "I see." His voice took on a tone that made Evelyn's skin prickle with warning. "You've already found yourself a replacement husband. How efficient." "Get out," Gideon said quietly, but there was violence coiled beneath the words. Travis mounted his horse with deliberate slowness, but before he rode away, he looked at Evelyn with something that might have been genuine regret or might have been the best performance she'd ever seen. "I'm staying at the hotel in town. When you're ready to hear the truth, the real truth, come find me." Then, louder, pitched to Carrie, "I'll be waiting for my bride." He rode off at a leisurely pace, and Evelyn stood frozen until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely. Then her legs gave out and she sat down hard on the porch steps. shaking so badly her teeth chattered. Gideon sat beside her without speaking, his presence solid and steadying. Maisie emerged from the house and pressed against Evelyn's side, and they stayed like that for a long time. Three people holding each other up against the weight of ugly history come calling. "He called you his bride," Maisie said finally, her voice small. "He's not—" Evelyn stopped, forced herself to breathe. "He lied about everything, Maisie. He's the man who was supposed to meet me at the train station, the one who never showed up. But he's here now." "Too late," Evelyn said firmly. "And for all the wrong reasons." Gideon's jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the horizon where Travis had disappeared. "What do you think he wants?" "I don't know." But Evelyn had a sick feeling she could guess. Travis Hart didn't strike her as the type to show up out of genuine remorse. He wanted something, and whatever it was couldn't be good. The answer came 2 days later, delivered not by Travis himself, but by town gossip that spread faster than prairie fire. Evelyn was at the mercantile picking up supplies when she noticed the other women watching her with expressions that ranged from pity to barely concealed fascination. Mrs. Brenner rang up her purchases with pursed lips, and finally Evelyn couldn't take the silence anymore. "What is it? What's everyone staring at?" Mrs. Brenner sighed. "That man who's been asking after you, Travis Hart, he calls himself, he's been talking. Says you're his intended bride, that you came all the way from Philadelphia to marry him, that he's here to honor his commitment and take you home." Evelyn felt ice slide down her spine. "That's not— I know it's not true, girl. Anyone with eyes can see you've made a life here." Mrs. Brenner's voice softened. "But he's been buying drinks at the saloon and telling stories, and some folks—" She hesitated. "Some folks are starting to wonder if maybe Callahan moved a bit quick taking you on, if maybe there's something not quite proper about the arrangement." The words hit like a physical blow. Evelyn gripped the counter to keep herself upright. "We're business partners. It's all legal, all documented. I know that too, but you know how people talk." Mrs. Brenner leaned forward, her voice dropping. "That Hart fellow, he's smooth, real smooth, and he's planting seeds, suggesting maybe you were coerced. Maybe you need rescuing. Maybe Callahan took advantage of a woman in a desperate situation." "That's insane. That's gossip." Mrs. Brenner straightened. "And gossip has a way of becoming truth if you don't fight it. You might want to set the record straight before this gets any uglier." Evelyn walked out of the mercantile with her supplies and her mind racing. She should have known Travis wouldn't just disappear. Men like him, men who made their living through charm and manipulation, they didn't give up when confronted. They adapted. And Travis had apparently decided that if he couldn't convince Evelyn directly, he'd use public opinion to force her hand. She was loading the wagon when a voice behind her made her freeze. "Hello, Evelyn." She turned to find Travis leaning against the hitching post, arms crossed, looking for all the world like a concerned gentleman checking on an old friend. "I asked you to leave me alone," she said. "I know, but I can't do that." Travis pushed off the post, moving closer. "Because, despite everything, I still care about you. And I can see you've gotten yourself into a situation that isn't," he paused delicately, "isn't what you deserve. The only situation I got into was believing your lies in the first place. I made mistakes. I admit that freely." Travis's voice was earnest, his eyes wide with sincerity that Evelyn no longer trusted for a second. "But I'm here now to make things right, to offer you what I should have offered from the beginning. A real home, a real future, not some arrangement with a widower who's using you for free labor." "Gideon isn't using me, isn't he?" Travis tilted his head. "He gets a housekeeper, a cook, someone to raise his child, and you get what exactly? A hard bed in a drafty house and work that'll break you down before you're 30? I get a partnership, I get respect. I get a life I'm building with my own hands instead of fantasies built on lies." "You get to be a servant," Travis corrected, his voice hardening slightly. "Come with me, Evelyn. Let me give you what you came west for in the first place. Let me make you my wife, my actual wife, legal and proper." For just a moment, one terrible, tempting moment, Evelyn let herself imagine it. Imagine saying yes. Imagine a life without calluses and exhaustion. Imagine soft sheets and a man who said pretty things. Then she remembered the cold calculation in Briggs's eyes, The warmth of Gideon's hand in hers, Maisie's fierce hug, the satisfaction of watching preserves sell in the mercantile, the partnership papers with her name beside Gideon's in black ink that couldn't be erased. "No," she said simply. Travis's mask slipped for just a second, showing something ugly underneath. Then it snapped back into place, the concerned suitor returning. "Think about it, please. I'm staying at the hotel for another week. The offer stands." He walked away, and Evelyn stood in the dusty street feeling like she'd just fought off something dangerous and escaped by inches. When she got back to the ranch, Gideon took one look at her face and sat her down with coffee she didn't want while Maisie played outside. What happened? Evelyn told him everything, the gossip, the confrontation, Travis's proposal. With every word, Gideon's expression grew darker until he looked like thunder about to break. "That son of a—" He stopped himself, glanced toward the window where Maisie was visible. "He's trying to ruin your reputation, so you'll have no choice but to go with him." "Why?" Evelyn's voice cracked. "Why go to all this trouble? He has nothing to gain from me." Gideon was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then, "Unless it's not about you specifically, unless it's about not losing." "What do you mean?" "Men like Hart, they're all ego. You rejected him, exposed him, chose someone else. That's a blow to his pride." Gideon's voice was grim. "He's not here to make amends. He's here to win, to prove he can still get what he wants even after being rejected." The analysis was so accurate it made Evelyn's skin crawl. "So what do I do?" "You ignore him. You live your life and let him see that his presence doesn't matter." Gideon's hand found hers across the table. "And if he keeps pushing, if he tries anything, then I'll bet—" "You'll what? Fight him?" "That's exactly what he wants, to make you look like the villain." Gideon's jaw clenched, but he nodded. "Then we be smart. We be patient. And we trust that the truth is stronger than his lies." But patience became harder 3 days later when Maisie came home from town crying so hard she could barely breathe. Evelyn was hanging laundry when she heard the wagon, and the sound of Maisie's sobs made her drop everything and run. Gideon was lifting the child down, his face white with fury, and Maisie was clutching a torn slate and gasping for air between sobs. "What happened?" Evelyn pulled Maisie into her arms, feeling the child's whole body shake. "Some boys," Maisie hiccuped. They said you're not really my mama, that you're a bad woman who's trying to steal my daddy, that everyone knows you should have married the fancy man, but you're too—" She dissolved into fresh tears. Evelyn looked at Gideon over Maisie's head, and the murder in his eyes was so clear she actually put a hand on his arm to hold him back. "Who?" she asked quietly. "Briggs's boys." Gideon's voice was shaking. "Harlan's nephews. They're repeating what they've heard at home, and what they've heard is Hart's poison." Evelyn held Maisie and rocked her while rage built in her chest, hot and bright and righteous. They'd come after her reputation. Fine, she could handle that. But going after a child? Using a little girl as a weapon in their ugly games? That was unforgivable. "I'm going to town," she said. "Evelyn, I'm going to town," she repeated, her voice like steel. "And I'm going to end this." She changed into her best dress, the brown one that was clean and pressed, and made her look like exactly what she was, a respectable woman who'd done nothing wrong. She pinned her hair up carefully, and when she looked in the mirror, she saw not the desperate bride from the train station, but someone harder, someone who'd survived and wouldn't be pushed around anymore. Gideon drove her into Dewsmere, silent and tense. Maisie stayed with Mrs. Kern, still sniffling, and Evelyn walked into the hotel with her spine straight and her head high. Travis was in the lobby, reading a newspaper like he had all the time in the world. He looked up when she entered, and his smile was pure victory. "Evelyn, I knew you'd— I'm not here to accept your proposal." Her voice carried through the lobby, and several people stopped to listen. "I'm here to tell you publicly, in front of witnesses, that you need to leave town and stop spreading lies about me." Travis's smile dimmed. "Lies?" "Evelyn, I've only told people the truth." "You've told them that I'm your intended bride. That's a lie. You've suggested that my partnership with Gideon Callahan is improper. That's a lie." Evelyn stepped closer, keeping her voice clear and firm. The truth is that you swindled me and at least two other women with false promises of marriage. The truth is that I came to Wyoming for a wedding that was never going to happen because you're a fraud. The truth is that I've built a legitimate life here, and your pride is hurt because I chose reality over your fantasies. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. Evelyn turned to address the growing audience. Travis Hart is a confidence man. He preys on lonely women, takes their money, and disappears. If you don't believe me, ask the station master, ask Mrs. Kern, ask the two other women who showed up here before me looking for husbands who didn't exist. Travis's face flushed red. You're hysterical. I'm done. Evelyn cut him off. Done with your lies, done with your manipulation, done pretending you have any power over my life. Leave town, Mr. Hart. There's nothing for you here. She turned and walked out, her hand shaking but her head high, and behind her the lobby erupted in whispers that would spread through Dewsmere faster than she could ride home. Gideon was waiting by the wagon, and when she reached him, he looked at her with something that might have been awe. He stopped. That was incredible. That was necessary, Evelyn corrected, but she couldn't stop the smile that broke across her face. They rode home in silence that felt lighter than it had in days. And when they pulled into the ranch yard, Maisie came running out with tear-stained cheeks and desperate hope in her eyes. Is he gone? Did you make him leave? Not yet, Evelyn admitted, kneeling to the child's level. But I told him and everyone else the truth, that he's a liar, and I'm exactly where I choose to be. Maisie threw her arms around Evelyn's neck with enough force to nearly knock them both over. I don't care what those stupid boys say. You're my family. You're supposed to be here. Evelyn held the child and felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been locked tight since her parents died, since she'd spent years teaching other people's children and dreaming of having her own someday. I love you too, sweetheart, she whispered. Over Maisie's head, she met Gideon's eyes and saw the same emotion reflected back at her. The terrifying, wonderful realization that they'd somehow become a family without meaning to. That what had started as desperation had transformed into something real. Travis Hart left town 2 days later, and the gossip about Evelyn shifted from scandalous speculation to grudging respect. Mrs. Brenner told everyone who'd listen that the Price girl had spine, and even Harlan Briggs stopped smirking when he passed them on the street. But the real change came quietly, in small moments. Gideon started calling her Evelyn instead of Miss Price, the formality dropping away like a shell they no longer needed. Maisie began asking if Evelyn would teach her to read properly, and they started having lessons at the kitchen table every afternoon. The loft where Evelyn slept remained hers, but somehow the whole house felt like theirs, shared space, shared work, shared purpose. One evening after Maisie was in bed, Evelyn and Gideon sat on the porch as they'd taken to doing, watching the stars emerge and letting the day's exhaustion settle into their bones. I never thanked you, Gideon said suddenly, for what you did with Hart. Standing up like that, publicly. It took more courage than most people have. He was hurting Maisie. That made it easy. Still, Gideon turned to look at her, his gray eyes serious in the lamplight spilling through the window. You could have left, could have taken him up on his offer and chosen an easier life, but you stayed and fought. That means something. It means I'm stubborn. It means you're loyal. Gideon's voice was soft and brave, and exactly the kind of partner I needed even though I didn't know it. Evelyn's throat tightened. Gideon, I'm not... He stopped, started again. I'm not good with words. Mary was the one who knew how to say things right. But I want you to know that you're not just help or a business arrangement or any of those practical things we told ourselves at the start. He took a breath. You're family. And I'm grateful every day that Maisie dragged you off that train station bench. Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes. I'm grateful too. They sat in silence after that, shoulders touching, and Evelyn let herself feel the full weight of what they'd built. Not perfect, not easy, but real and solid, and worth every hard moment. The ranch was theirs. The future was theirs. And whatever came next, they'd face it together. Inside, Maisie stirred in her sleep and called out softly. Evelyn rose to check on her, and when she returned, Gideon was still on the porch, looking out at the land with an expression that might have been peace. She sat back down beside him, and when his hand found hers in the darkness, she held on tight. They'd survived Travis Hart's manipulations, Briggs's threats, and their own desperate circumstances. But what neither of them knew, what they couldn't possibly know as they sat together under the Wyoming stars, was that the hardest test was still to come. And it would arrive not with lies or threats, but with fire. The fire came on what should have been the happiest day of their lives. It started as a normal Saturday morning, 3 weeks after Travis Hart had slunk out of town with his tail between his legs. Evelyn was kneading bread dough while Maisie practiced her letters at the table, and Gideon was in the barn checking on a mare about to foal. The autumn air was crisp and clean, the sky so blue it hurt to look at directly, and everything felt settled in a way it hadn't since Evelyn had arrived. Then Gideon came through the door with an expression on his face that made Evelyn's hands still in the dough. "There's something I need to ask you," he said. "Both of you." Maisie looked up from her slate, curiosity bright in her gray eyes. Evelyn wiped her hands on her apron, her heart suddenly beating too fast. Gideon stood in the middle of the kitchen looking like a man about to jump off a cliff. He took a breath, then pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and set it on the table. "I went to see the lawyer in town yesterday, asked him to draw something up." He pushed the paper toward Evelyn. "It's a marriage license application, already filled out. Just needs our signatures and a witness." The world tilted sideways. Evelyn stared at the paper like it might bite her. "I know this isn't romantic," Gideon continued, his voice rough. "I know I'm not offering you poetry or pretty words, but I'm offering you everything I have, my name, my home, my future, all of it legal and binding and real. Not because I need help or because it's convenient, but because—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "Because somewhere between fence posts and preserves and fighting off con men, I fell in love with you. And I hope, maybe you feel something similar." Evelyn couldn't breathe. She looked at the paper, at Gideon's careful handwriting filling in the blanks, at the space where her signature would make it real. "Marry him." Maisie's voice broke the silence, pitched high with excitement. "Say yes, say yes, say yes! Maisie, hush!" But Gideon was looking at Evelyn with his heart in his eyes, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen him. "You don't have to answer now. Take time to think." "Yes." The word came out before Evelyn could second-guess it. "Yes, I'll marry you." Gideon's face transformed, relief and joy and something fiercer mixing together. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." Evelyn moved around the table, flour still dusting her hands, and looked up at this complicated, grieving, steadfast man who'd given her a home when she'd had nowhere else to go. "I love you too. I think I have for weeks, but I was too afraid to say it." Maisie let out a shriek that probably scared the chickens, and then they were all tangled together in an embrace that felt like coming home. "Can we do it today?" Maisie demanded. "Please, I want you to be my real mama today." Gideon laughed, a sound Evelyn had heard so rarely it made her throat tight. "We need a witness and someone to perform the ceremony, but maybe—" He looked at Evelyn. "Maybe we could ride into town, see if Horace and Mrs. Kern would stand for us. The minister could do it quick and simple." "Simple sounds perfect," Evelyn said. They cleaned up in a rush, Evelyn changing into her best dress, Maisie braiding her own hair with shaking fingers, Gideon putting on a clean shirt and actually combing his hair. They hitched up the wagon and rode toward Dewsmere, with Maisie bouncing between them and chattering about weddings she'd never seen but had strong opinions about anyway. "You need flowers," she declared. "Mama had flowers." "We'll pick wildflowers on the way back," Evelyn promised, and felt the ghost of Mary Callahan's presence like a blessing instead of a weight. They found Horace at the train station, and when Gideon explained what they needed, the old man's face split into a grin so wide it showed his missing back teeth. "About damn time. I'll stand witness with pleasure." Mrs. Kern took more convincing. She looked at them with narrowed eyes and asked Evelyn 3 times if she was certain, if this was what she truly wanted, if she understood what ranch life meant for the long haul. When Evelyn answered yes to everything without hesitation, Mrs. Kern nodded sharply and said she'd be honored to stand for the bride. The minister was a thin man named Reverend Michaels, who'd seen enough frontier marriages to ask no questions beyond the legal requirements. They gathered in the small church with its crooked steeple, just the five of them, and Evelyn thought about the wedding she'd imagined in Philadelphia. The one with a full congregation, and a dress that cost $17, and a groom who didn't exist. This was better. This was real. Gideon held her hands and repeated vows in a voice that shook only slightly. And when it was Evelyn's turn, she said the words clearly because she meant every single one. The minister pronounced them married. Gideon kissed her with a gentleness that made her knees weak, and Maisie clapped so hard her palms must have stung. Horace shook Gideon's hand and hugged Evelyn with surprising strength. Mrs. Kern pressed a jar of preserves into Evelyn's hands. Mary's recipe, saved special, and her eyes were suspiciously bright. They signed the license at the minister's desk, and Evelyn watched her name change on paper. Evelyn Price becoming Evelyn Callahan in strokes of ink that felt like magic. "We should celebrate," Horace said. "Dinner at the hotel, my treat." "That's generous," Gideon started, but Evelyn saw the exhaustion creeping into his eyes and the way Maisie was starting to droop. "Actually," she said, "I think we'd like to go home. Have a quiet supper, just the three of us." Understanding passed across Horace's face. "Next time, then. Congratulations, both of you." They rode back toward the ranch in the late afternoon with the sun beginning its slow descent toward the horizon. Maisie fell asleep against Evelyn's shoulder, and Gideon drove with one hand while the other held Evelyn's, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for saying yes, for staying, for—" He stopped, emotion thickening his voice. "For all of it." "Thank you for asking," Evelyn replied, "for taking a chance on the desperate woman your daughter dragged home." "Best thing Maisie ever dragged home." Gideon's smile was soft. "And I've seen her drag home some strange things." They were laughing when they crested the last hill and saw the smoke, black and thick, rising from the direction of the ranch in a column that punched into the perfect blue sky like a fist. Gideon's face went white. "No." He snapped the reins and the horses bolted forward, the wagon bouncing violently over the rough road. Maisie woke with a cry, and Evelyn held her tight while her heart hammered against her ribs. The barn was burning. They saw it from half a mile away, flames climbing the old gray wood, consuming it with terrifying speed. By the time they reached the yard, the entire structure was engulfed, heat rolling out in waves that made the air shimmer. Gideon leaped from the wagon before it fully stopped. "The horses! Gideon, no!" Evelyn grabbed for him, but he was already running, and she thrust Maisie into the back of the wagon. "Stay here! Don't move!" She ran after Gideon, terror and adrenaline making everything sharp and bright and too real. He'd already reached the barn doors, or what was left of them, and she could hear the horses inside screaming, that high panicked sound that animals make when they know they're going to die. "You can't go in there!" She grabbed his arm, tried to pull him back, but he shook her off with desperate strength. "They'll burn alive!" The heat was incredible. Evelyn could feel it singeing the hair on her arms, could smell burning wood and hay and the acrid stench of fear. Inside the barn, something collapsed with a crash that sent sparks shooting into the air. Gideon wrapped his shirt around his face and plunged into the smoke. Evelyn stood frozen for one terrible heartbeat. Then she grabbed a horse blanket from the wagon, soaked it with water from the barrel, and followed him into hell. The smoke was suffocating, thick and black and poisonous. Evelyn couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, couldn't breathe without choking, couldn't hear anything over the roar of flames and the screaming horses. She felt her way forward, following the sound of Gideon's voice calling to the animals, trying to calm them enough to get them out. She found him at the first stall, struggling with a terrified mare who was rearing and kicking. The horse's eyes rolled white with panic, and Gideon's hands were already blistered from fighting with the hot metal latch. Evelyn grabbed the horse's halter, got her weight under the animal's head, and somehow, through luck or desperation or sheer stubborn will, they got her turned toward where the doors used to be. The mare bolted the moment she saw daylight, nearly trampling them both. "Two more!" Gideon shouted over the roar. They stumbled deeper into the burning barn. The heat was unbearable now, flames climbing the walls on both sides, the loft overhead groaning as the supports weakened. Evelyn's lungs burned with every breath, and she could feel blisters rising on her hands and face. The second horse, the gelding Gideon used for ranch work, was easier. Panicked, but not violent, and he followed Gideon out at a stumbling run. The third horse was Rosie, the gentle mare Evelyn had ridden to check the cattle. She was in the back stall, trapped behind a beam that had fallen across the doorway, and when Evelyn reached her, the mare was standing with her head hanging low, already breathing smoke. "Help me lift it!" Gideon grabbed one end of the beam. Evelyn grabbed the other. The wood was hot enough to burn through the wet blanket protecting her hands, but she gripped it anyway and lifted with everything she had. The beam moved, barely, but enough. Gideon kicked open the stall door and grabbed Rosie's halter. The mare didn't want to move, too far gone in panic and smoke inhalation, but Gideon hauled her forward with brute strength while Evelyn pushed from behind. They were halfway to the door when the ceiling started to collapse. Evelyn heard it before she saw it, a groaning crack that made her look up just in time to see the loft floor giving way, flames and timber falling toward them like judgment. "Run!" Gideon's voice was a roar. They ran. Evelyn's lungs were screaming, her vision going dark at the edges, but she ran anyway. Beside her, Gideon dragged the stumbling mare forward, and behind them the barn collapsed inward with a sound like the end of the world. They tumbled out into clean air and fell to their knees in the dirt, coughing so hard Evelyn thought she might break ribs. The mare staggered a few steps and then stood with her head hanging, sides heaving, but alive. Maisie was there, crying and grabbing at them both, and somehow they all ended up in a pile on the ground, coughing and burned and covered in soot, but breathing. The barn burned for another hour, and there was nothing they could do but watch it go. Gideon sat with his arms around Maisie and Evelyn, and nobody spoke because there were no words for watching everything you'd built turn to ash. By the time the last flames died down to embers, the sun had set, and the yard was lit by dying firelight. The barn was gone, nothing left but blackened timbers and smoking wreckage. The 3 horses they'd saved stood in the corral, traumatized but alive. Everything else, tools, hay, grain, 2 years of accumulated supplies, was destroyed. How did it start? Evelyn's voice was hoarse from smoke. Gideon shook his head. I don't know. I banked the forge before we left, checked everything twice. He stared at the ruins with hollow eyes. Maybe a spark caught. Maybe the wood was drier than I thought. Maybe... He stopped, his jaw clenching. Maybe it doesn't matter. But it did matter, and the answer came at dawn when Harlan Briggs rode into the yard with 2 men Evelyn didn't recognize and a smile that made her skin crawl. Heard you had some trouble, Briggs said, surveying the destruction with satisfaction that was barely hidden. Shame about the barn. That's going to set you back considerable. Gideon stood slowly, his whole body radiating controlled violence. What do you want, Briggs? Just came to offer my condolences. And maybe... Briggs's smile widened, to remind you that accidents happen on ranches, especially to folks who don't have the resources to protect their property proper. Are you threatening us? Evelyn's voice was cold. Threatening? No, ma'am. Briggs's tone was all false innocence. Just stating facts. Fires are dangerous things. Never know when one might start up again. He turned his horse. You folks take care now. He rode away, and Evelyn felt Gideon shaking beside her, not with fear, but with rage so pure it was almost visible. He did this, Gideon said flatly. Somehow, he did this. Paid someone maybe, or did it himself. Punishment for paying off the loan and making him look bad. We can't prove it. I know, Gideon's voice cracked. And that makes it worse. They stood in the ruins of their barn and faced the brutal truth. They'd survived Travis Hart's manipulations and Briggs's foreclosure attempt, but this was something different. This was malice, pure and simple, and it had cost them everything. The house was intact, and they had the 3 horses, but winter was coming, and they had no shelter for the animals, no hay stored, no tools beyond what was in the house. The partnership that had felt so solid yesterday was now held together by nothing but determination and the smoking wreckage of their optimism. That night, Maisie cried herself to sleep asking if they were going to lose the ranch now, and Gideon sat at the table with his head in his hands, looking more defeated than Evelyn had ever seen him. She wanted to comfort him, wanted to say something reassuring, but the truth was she didn't know if they could recover from this. The barn had been critical infrastructure. Losing it was like losing the heart of the ranch. She was still sitting there trying to find words when a knock came at the door. It was full dark now, well past the hour for visitors, and Evelyn's first thought was that Briggs had come back to gloat. But when Gideon opened the door, it was Horace standing there with Mrs. Kern beside him and half the town behind them. "We heard about the fire," Horace said simply. "Came to help." What followed was something Evelyn would remember for the rest of her life. The people of Dewsmere, ranchers and shopkeepers, and women who'd once gossiped about the desperate bride at the train station came with tools and timber and food and determination. They came at dawn and worked until dark, and when the sun rose on the second day they came again. Mrs. Brenner brought lumber from the mercantile at cost. The blacksmith brought tools to replace what had burned. Women brought meals and took over the kitchen so Evelyn could work alongside the men. Even the minister showed up with a hammer and surprising skill at framing. They built a new barn in 5 days. It wasn't as large as the old one, and the wood was rough and unseasoned, but it was solid and it was theirs. Gideon worked like a man possessed, and Evelyn was beside him every step, holding beams, driving nails, her hands blistered and her back screaming, but refusing to stop. On the 5th evening, when the last board was nailed and the roof was shingled and the whole structure stood solid against the darkening sky, Horace raised a cup of whiskey someone had brought, and the whole crowd raised theirs in return. "To the Callahans," he called out, "and to not letting bastards win." The cheer that went up probably carried all the way to Cheyenne. People drifted away as darkness fell, back to their own homes and lives, until finally it was just Gideon and Evelyn and Maisie standing in the yard looking at what their community had built. "I can't believe they did this," Gideon said, his voice thick with emotion. "Believe it," Mrs. Kern said from behind them. She'd stayed to help Evelyn clean up, and now she stood on the porch with her arms crossed. "This is what decent folks do when someone tries to burn down their neighbors. They build it back up and dare the bastards to try again." She went inside, and the three of them were left alone under the stars. Maisie was already half asleep on her feet, so Gideon carried her to bed. Evelyn heard their quiet good-night ritual through the wall, and when Gideon emerged he looked exhausted and overwhelmed and grateful all at once. "Come here," Evelyn said, holding out her hand. They went outside and sat on the porch steps, and for a long time they just breathed in the night air and let the reality of what had happened settle over them. "We could have died in that fire," Gideon said finally. "All three of us. Going into that barn was—" He stopped, his voice breaking. "It was the stupidest, bravest thing I've ever seen you do. You went in first. I'm a rancher. I've done stupid things with animals my whole life." He turned to look at her, and even in the darkness she could see the intensity in his eyes. "But you're a schoolteacher from Philadelphia who came west for a wedding that didn't exist. You had no reason to risk your life for horses that aren't even yours." "They are mine," Evelyn corrected gently. "Everything here is mine now. That's what marriage means. That's what partnership means." She took his burned hands in hers. "I'm not going anywhere, Gideon. Not for fires or threats or anything else this territory wants to throw at us." Gideon pulled her against him, and she felt him shaking with emotion he'd been holding back for days. "I love you," he whispered into her hair. "I loved Mary, and I thought that was it for me. Thought I'd had my chance and lost it. But then Maisie dragged you home and you stayed even though you had every reason to leave, and somehow you made me believe in second chances." Evelyn pulled back enough to see his face. "I love you too, and I'm grateful every day that I got on the wrong train." "The right train," Gideon corrected, and kissed her like a promise. They sat there until the stars wheeled overhead and the night grew cold, and when they finally went inside, Evelyn felt something settle in her chest that felt like peace. The next morning brought one final surprise. Evelyn was making breakfast when she heard horses in the yard and looked out to see Sheriff Morrison, a man she'd seen around town but never spoken to, dismounting with Harlan Briggs in handcuffs behind him. Gideon met them at the door, confusion written across his face. "Sheriff?" "Morning, Callahan." Morrison tipped his hat. "Came to let you know we arrested Briggs here for arson. Got a witness who saw him paying some drifter to start your fire. Drifter got drunk and talked, and, well," he gestured to the handcuffed Briggs. "Justice catches up eventually." Briggs's face was purple with rage. "You can't prove anything. Got a signed statement, and a witness willing to testify. That's plenty. Morrison looked at Gideon. He'll be tried in Cheyenne, likely looking at prison time. Gideon stared at Briggs with an expression that cycled through shock, rage, and finally something that might have been pity. Why? We paid what we owed. You had no reason. You made me look weak, Briggs spat. Made me look like a fool in front of the whole town. Someone had to teach you a lesson. The only lesson here, Sheriff Morrison said mildly, is that setting fires is a crime, and crimes have consequences. He hauled Briggs back toward his horse. You folks have a good day now. They watched the sheriff ride away with his prisoner, and then Gideon turned to Evelyn with wonder on his face. It's over. It's actually over. It's over, she confirmed, and felt the last knot of fear in her chest finally loosen. That afternoon, Gideon did something Evelyn had never seen him do. He went to the low hill where Mary Callahan was buried, and Evelyn watched from a distance as he knelt by the cross and spoke to his first wife, telling her about the new barn, about the community that had saved them, about Evelyn and the second chance he'd never expected to have. When he came back, his eyes were red, but his step was lighter. She'd like you, he said simply. Mary would like you a lot. I hope so, Evelyn replied. I'm raising her daughter and loving her husband. I'd hate to think she'd disapprove. Gideon smiled, a real smile, full and genuine. She wouldn't. She'd be grateful. That night they had dinner as a family, real dinner, not just fuel to get through another day of crisis. Maisie talked about school and her friends, and Gideon told stories about breaking horses, and Evelyn sat at the head of the table in the house that was now legally hers and felt complete in a way she'd never felt before. After Maisie was in bed, Gideon pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. I wrote you something, he said, looking embarrassed. Back when I was trying to figure out how to propose. Never gave it to you because everything happened so fast with the wedding and then the fire. He held it out. But I want you to have it anyway. Evelyn unfolded the paper. Gideon's handwriting was cramped and uneven, but the words were clear. Dear Evelyn, I'm not good with pretty words like the letters that brought you west. I can't promise you an easy life or a fancy house or anything except hard work and long winters, but I can promise you honesty. I can promise that I'll work beside you, not above you. I can promise that Maisie and I need you more than we knew how to say. And I can promise that if you'll have me, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the woman who refused to quit, even when she had every reason to. That's not much, I know, but it's real. And real is the only thing I know how to give. Yours, Gideon. Evelyn read it twice, her vision blurring with tears. Then she looked up at this man who'd given her everything Thomas Brennan had promised, and more. Not fantasy, but foundation. Not pretty lies, but honest truth. It's perfect, she whispered. It's exactly what I needed to hear. Gideon pulled her close, and they stood together in the quiet kitchen while outside the new barn stood solid against the Wyoming night. 2 months later, the first snow fell. Evelyn woke to find the world transformed, white and clean and beautiful. She climbed out of bed, the real bed she now shared with Gideon in the room they'd made theirs, and padded to the window. The ranch looked like something from a dream. The new barn wore snow like a crown. The horses stood in the corral with frost on their manes. The land rolled away in endless white, broken only by the dark line of the creek and the hills beyond. Come back to bed, Gideon mumbled sleepily. It's freezing. Evelyn turned to look at him, hair mussed, face soft with sleep, the scars from the fire healing on his hands, and felt her heart swell with love so fierce it almost hurt. Just looking at our future, she said. And she was. The ranch they'd fought for, the family they'd built, the life they were creating together one hard day at a time. It wasn't the fantasy she'd imagined on that train from Philadelphia. It was better. Because it was real, and it was earned, and it was theirs. Maisie appeared in the doorway in her nightgown, eyes wide. It snowed! Can we play in it after breakfast? We can play in it after chores, Evelyn corrected, but she was smiling. Come here, sweetheart. Maisie climbed into bed between them, and they lay there as a family, warm under quilts while winter pressed against the windows. And Evelyn thought about the train station bench where she'd sat in her ruined wedding dress just 4 months ago. She'd thought her life was over. Instead, it had just been beginning. The wrong train had brought her to the right place. The phantom groom had led her to a real husband. The disaster had transformed into a miracle. And now, as snow fell on their Wyoming ranch and Maisie chattered about building snowmen, and Gideon's hand found hers under the blankets, Evelyn Price Callahan knew with absolute certainty what she'd only suspected before. She was exactly where she belonged. Home,